The convoy of military trucks bounced and lurched over the rutted path that could barely be called a road, each pothole sending jolts through the wooden benches where the prisoners sat. The women inside maintained rigid postures despite the discomfort, their spines straight and their chins lifted in a show of composure that had become second nature during their years of service. They wore the remnants of their uniforms, though the fabric had grown soft with wear and the colours had faded from repeated washings in cold water. Their leather boots, once polished to a high shine, now bore scuffs and cracks that told the story of long marches and longer waits. Among them sat nurses who had tended wounds in field hospitals, clerks who had managed endless paperwork in military offices, and auxiliaries who had supported the war machine in countless unseen ways. Each woman carried herself with a deliberate dignity, as though by holding their bodies correctly they could maintain some thread of control over circumstances that had spiraled far beyond their grasp. The trucks slowed as they approached the entrance to the prisoner of war camp, and through the gaps in the canvas covering, the women caught their first glimpses of the place that would become their new reality. They had steeled themselves for this moment during the entire journey, preparing mentally for the harshness they assumed awaited them. Stories of enemy cruelty had been fed to them throughout the war, tales of barbarism and revenge that painted their captors as little more than savage brutes. They expected to be met with violence, perhaps even brutality, certainly with the kind of harsh treatment that prisoners of the defeated deserved. Their muscles tensed as the trucks came to a complete stop and the engines cut off, leaving only the sound of boots crunching on gravel and distant voices speaking in that foreign tongue that still sounded strange to their ears. When the canvas was pulled back and they were ordered to disembark, the women climbed down from the trucks with deliberate slowness, refusing to show weakness or fear. They assembled themselves into rough formations without being told, falling back on the discipline that had been drilled into them over years of wartime service. Their eyes scanned the compound, taking in the wooden barracks, the guard towers, the coils of barbed wire that marked the boundaries of their new prison. But what captured their attention most was the sight of the American soldiers who were to be their guards. These men stood in loose groups, their postures relaxed to the point of seeming careless. They held their rifles as though the weapons were an afterthought rather than instruments of authority. Some had pushed their helmets back on their heads, revealing young faces that seemed hardly old enough for the responsibilities they bore. One soldier worked his jaw in a constant chewing motion, and as the women watched, he blew a large bubble with his gum that expanded and expanded before bursting with a sound that seemed absurdly loud in the tense silence of the moment. Another guard had propped his rifle against his shoulder like a farmer might rest a shovel. His weight shifted onto one hip in a stance that suggested boredom rather than vigilance. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, displaying forearms that were indeed thick with muscle, though these looked like the muscles earned from honest labour rather than military drilling. The sight of these casual, almost slovenly guards struck the German women as profoundly wrong. They had been trained to see their enemies as efficient killing machines, as soldiers who would maintain perfect military bearing at all times. Instead, they found themselves facing what appeared to be a group of farm boys and factory workers who had been handed uniforms and rifles and told to stand watch. The disconnect between expectation and reality was so jarring that several of the women felt a nervous laugh bubbling up in their throats before they could suppress it. The laughter started small, just a quiet giggle from somewhere in the back ranks, but it spread like a contagion through the group of prisoners. These were the men who had defeated the Wehrmacht. These relaxed, gum-chewing boys were the vaunted American army they had been warned about. One woman leaned toward her companion and whispered in rapid German, making a comment about how the guard with the rolled sleeves looked more suited to ploughing fields than guarding prisoners. Her friend snickered in response, and soon the whispers were circulating through the group, each woman finding some detail to mock or ridicule. They pointed out the guard who seemed barely able to keep his helmet from sliding off his head, the one whose boots didn't match, the one who stood with such poor posture that their own drill sergeants would have screamed themselves hoarse. The American guards noticed the laughter, of course. It would have been impossible not to notice the way the German women were looking at them. The barely suppressed smiles and the whispered comments in a language most of the guards couldn't understand, but whose mocking tone needed no translation. The soldiers glanced at one another, exchanging looks that mixed embarrassment with confusion. Some of them shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny, suddenly conscious of their casual postures and relaxed demeanour. But none of them responded with anger or threats. One guard, a young man with sandy hair and a sunburned nose, actually grinned in a sheepish way, as though he found something amusing in being laughed at by prisoners. He shrugged his shoulders at his fellow guards, a gesture that seemed to say he had no idea what to make of this situation. Another soldier made a comment in English that his buddies chuckled at, though the German women couldn't understand the words. This lack of retaliation, this refusal to meet mockery with punishment, unnerved the women more than any amount of shouting or threatening could have done. They understood cruelty. Cruelty made sense in the context of war, in the aftermath of defeat. Cruelty was something they could brace themselves against, something that would confirm everything they had been taught about their enemies. But this patient tolerance, this almost amused acceptance of their ridicule, created a dissonance in their minds that was deeply unsettling. If these guards didn't fit the image of the brutal enemy they had been prepared for, then what did that say about everything else they had been told? The questions formed at the edges of their consciousness, but were quickly pushed away. It was easier to keep laughing, to maintain the fiction that these men were simply inadequate soldiers who had somehow stumbled into victory through luck rather than skill. Among the prisoners stood a young woman with dark brown hair that she had tied back in a practical bun, though wisps had escaped during the journey and now framed her face in a way that softened her otherwise severe expression. She had served as a nurse in a field hospital, tending to wounded soldiers who arrived in waves of blood and mud and screaming. She had developed a hard shell over the months and years of war, learning to shut down the part of herself that felt too deeply in order to function in the face of so much suffering. Now, as she stood among her fellow prisoners and listened to their mocking laughter, she found her attention drawn to one guard in particular. He was tall, with a lanky build that suggested he hadn't quite grown into his full frame. What caught her eye were the freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks, so many that they almost formed a solid patch of darker skin. His eyes were a clear blue, the kind of blue that reminded her of summer skies from her childhood, and when his gaze happened to sweep across the group of prisoners and briefly met hers, she felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly, though there was certainly an element of caution in her reaction. It was more a sense of recognition, as though some part of her understood on an instinctive level that this man was going to be significant in some way she couldn't yet define. She tore her gaze away quickly, disturbed by the feeling and angry at herself for even noticing such details about one of their captors. What did it matter what colour his eyes were or how many freckles he had? He was the enemy, she reminded herself firmly. He was part of the machinery that had defeated her country and brought her to this place of captivity. His appearance was irrelevant. And yet, even as she told herself these things, she found her eyes drifting back toward him, watching the way he moved as he walked along the line of prisoners, observing the careful way he held himself, as though he too was uncertain about how to navigate this strange new dynamic between captor and captive. As the afternoon wore on, the women were processed through the administrative procedures of the camp. Names were checked against lists, belongings were searched and catalogued, and they were assigned to their barracks. Through it all, they maintained their defiant postures and their mocking whispers, though the laughter had become somewhat more subdued as the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were led in groups to the wooden structures that would house them, buildings that smelled of fresh-cut lumber and the harsh soap that had been used to scrub the floors and walls. The barracks were basic but not uncomfortable, with rows of bunk beds covered in thin but clean blankets and small windows that let in the late afternoon light. The women claimed their beds quickly, each staking out her small territory in this new world, and then gathered near the windows to peer out at the compound beyond. Through the glass, they could see the guards finishing their shift rotations, gathering in small groups to smoke cigarettes and talk among themselves. The American soldiers laughed easily with one another, their voices carrying on the evening air. They punched each other's shoulders in friendly gestures and passed around packs of cigarettes and what looked like photographs from home. The informality of it all continued to baffle the German women, who had been trained in a system where military discipline was absolute and casual fraternization between ranks was forbidden. These Americans seemed to have no such restrictions, or if they did, they ignored them completely. Officers and enlisted men stood together in relaxed circles, and the deference shown to rank was subtle rather than the rigid formality the women were accustomed to. As darkness fell and lamps were lit around the compound, the women climbed into their bunks and pulled the thin blankets up to their chins. The whispers that had been bold and mocking during daylight hours became quieter now, more uncertain. Some women continued to ridicule the guards, calling them overgrown children who were playing at being soldiers. Others suggested that the casual behaviour was itself a form of psychological warfare, designed to lull the prisoners into a false sense of security. But a few fell silent, lost in their own thoughts as they stared at the ceiling or out the windows toward the dim lights of the guard stations. The brunette nurse lay on her bunk, her mind churning with thoughts she couldn't quite organise. She kept seeing those blue eyes, that brief moment of eye contact that had felt somehow weighted with meaning she couldn't decipher. She told herself it was nothing, just an accidental meeting of gazes that happened 1,000 times a day without significance. But her heart, foolish organ that it was, had picked up its pace when those eyes met hers, and even now, hours later, she could still feel the echo of that acceleration in her chest. Outside, the sounds of the guards settling in for the evening watch filtered through the windows. Someone was playing a harmonica, the notes drifting across the compound in a melody that sounded both mournful and oddly hopeful at the same time. The sound was alien and yet strangely comforting, a reminder that even in this place of barbed wire and guard towers, there was still music, still laughter, still life continuing in its ordinary patterns. The women listened in silence, each processing the day in her own way. Some felt anger at their defeat and capture. Others felt relief that they had survived the war, even if survival came at the cost of freedom. A few, like the brunette nurse, felt something more complicated and harder to name, a swirling mixture of confusion and curiosity, and something that might have been the very beginnings of hope, though hope for what she couldn't have said. She whispered into the darkness, knowing no one could hear her, calling herself a fool for letting her thoughts wander in such dangerous directions. These men were not friends, they were not potential allies, they were the enemy, and the fact that they smiled and played music and treated their prisoners with basic decency didn't change that fundamental truth. And yet, as she finally drifted towards sleep, the last image in her mind was of freckles and blue eyes, and a face that seemed to carry more kindness than cruelty. She didn't want to think about what that might mean, but her subconscious had already begun weaving patterns from these observations, creating narratives that her waking mind refused to acknowledge. The first night in captivity ended not with tears or rage, but with quiet confusion and the unsettling realization that nothing was quite as they had expected it to be. The next morning arrived with the harsh clang of a bell that jolted the women from their restless sleep. They emerged from their barracks into the cool dawn air, their breath forming small clouds in the chill. Roll call was conducted with the same informal efficiency that characterized everything the Americans did. The guards moved down the lines with their clipboards, checking names and counting heads, but there was none of the shouting or rigid ceremony that would have accompanied such a procedure in their own military. The German women stood at attention anyway, unable to break the habits drilled into them over years of service, even though their captors seemed unconcerned with such formalities. As the guards passed, the whispers and giggles started again. One prisoner nudged another and made a comment about how the guard's helmet was tilted at such an angle that it looked ready to fall off at any moment. Someone else noticed that one soldier's boots appeared to be two different shades of black, as though he had lost one and simply grabbed a replacement without caring about the match. The laughter rippled through the formation once more, though it had a different quality this morning. The edge of hysteria had worn off, leaving behind something that felt more performative, as though the women were laughing because they felt they should, because maintaining their mockery was safer than examining the alternative feelings that were beginning to surface. The Americans continued their work with the same patient indifference they had shown the day before. When they overheard the laughter, some smiled slightly, as though finding something amusing in the situation themselves. One guard made eye contact with a giggling prisoner and gave her a mock salute, his expression so good-natured that the woman's laughter caught in her throat, confused by the lack of malice in the gesture. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave. Enemies were supposed to hate each other, to view each other with suspicion and contempt. This casual friendliness, this refusal to be offended by their mockery, created a cognitive dissonance that was increasingly difficult to maintain. After roll call, the women were assigned to various work details around the camp. Some were sent to the laundry facilities, others to the kitchens, and still others to help with general maintenance and cleaning. The brunette nurse found herself in a group tasked with assisting in the camp infirmary, a role that made sense given her medical training. As they walked toward their assigned locations, the smell of cooking food wafted across the compound. It was a surprisingly pleasant smell, rich and savoury, so different from the thin gruel and black bread that had sustained them during the final months of the war. When they reached the kitchen to collect their breakfast rations, they found tables laden with scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and real coffee. The sight of so much food that smelled good and appeared to have been prepared with care, was almost shocking after the deprivations they had endured. One woman made a great show of wrinkling her nose and pretending to be disgusted by the American food, declaring loudly in German that this was what these people considered edible. The others laughed and joined in the criticism, though their eyes betrayed them, lingering on the plates of hot food with undisguised hunger. When the trays were handed to them, they accepted with as much disdain as they could muster, but the moment they began eating, the pretense became impossible to maintain. The food was good. Better than good, it was delicious in the way that only food can be when you've been truly hungry for too long. They ate quickly, trying not to let their enjoyment show, but their silence spoke louder than any words could have. The guard who had helped serve the food noticed their reactions and smiled to himself, a small expression that suggested he understood exactly what they were feeling, even if they couldn't admit it out loud. The workday passed in a blur of activity. The women threw themselves into their assigned tasks with typical German efficiency, perhaps trying to prove that they were not defeated in spirit, even if their armies had been defeated on the battlefield. The brunette nurse worked in the infirmary, organising supplies and assisting the camp doctor with minor medical procedures. The doctor was an American, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and gentle hands who treated her not as a prisoner, but as a fellow medical professional. He asked for her opinions, deferred to her expertise in certain areas, and thanked her for her help in a way that suggested genuine appreciation rather than the patronising tone she might have expected. This too was disorienting, this treatment as an equal rather than as a conquered enemy to be humiliated and degraded. That evening, when the women returned to their barracks, they were exhausted from the day's work, but also, paradoxically, more energized than they had been in months. Having useful work to do, being treated with a basic level of respect, and eating adequate food had begun to work changes in them that were subtle but unmistakable. They gathered on their bunks and in the small common area, and the conversations that had been filled with mocking laughter yesterday now turned to more confused and complicated topics. Why did the guards not punish them for their insolence? Why did they provide such good food when surely it would be easier and cheaper to feed prisoners minimally? Why did they treat them with kindness when cruelty would have been not only acceptable but expected? One woman finally voiced the question that had been hovering unspoken in all their minds, asking why these men didn't seem to hate them the way enemies should hate each other. No one had a good answer. They offered various theories, some cynical, suggesting it was all a trick to make them compliant and easier to control. Others wondered if perhaps the Americans simply didn't understand the gravity of the war, didn't feel the personal animosity that came from years of propaganda and conflict. A few suggested, hesitantly, that maybe their captors were genuinely trying to follow the rules of the Geneva Convention, treating prisoners of war with the basic humanity required by international law. But none of these explanations felt entirely satisfying. The truth was more complex and harder to articulate, having something to do with the fundamental character of the men who guarded them, with cultural differences they didn't fully understand, and with the simple fact that hatred is harder to maintain when you're face to face with other human beings rather than abstract enemies. The brunette nurse lay in her bunk that night, staring at the wooden slats of the bunk above her and listening to the gradually quieting voices of her companions. She thought about the freckled guard, whom she had seen several times throughout the day. Each time their paths had crossed, whether in passing on the walkways or when he was posted near the infirmary, she had felt that same strange tightening in her chest. Once, when he had handed her a clipboard that needed a signature, their fingers had brushed for the briefest instant, and the contact had sent what felt like an electric current up her arm. It was absurd, she told herself firmly. She was a prisoner of war. He was her captor. And any feelings beyond the appropriate resentment and wariness were not only inappropriate, but potentially dangerous. Yet she couldn't deny that when she had opened the door of the infirmary that afternoon and found him standing there, waiting to escort her back to the barracks, her heart had done an uncomfortable flip in her chest. She had noticed details about him that she had no business noticing. The way his hair curled slightly where it emerged from under his helmet. The careful way he moved, as though he was always conscious of his size and trying not to seem threatening. The fact that when he looked at her, his expression held not hunger or possessiveness, but a kind of shy curiosity, as though he too was trying to figure out this strange dynamic between them. These observations felt like betrayals, as though by noticing such things she was somehow abandoning her loyalty to her defeated country and her captured comrades. She pressed her face into her thin pillow and whispered harshly to herself in German, reminding herself that she was being foolish, that these thoughts were not only inappropriate but dangerous, that she needed to stop noticing blue eyes and freckles and the way certain smiles made her stomach do complicated things. But even as she scolded herself, she knew that something had shifted. The laughter that had sustained them on the first day, the mocking ridicule that had helped them maintain their sense of superiority even in defeat, was already beginning to ring hollow. It was being replaced by something more complicated, a growing awareness that their captors were not the monsters they had been taught to expect, but simply men. Young men, tired men, men who seemed as uncertain about this situation as the women themselves. And with that awareness came a host of more dangerous feelings, emotions that had no place in a prisoner of war camp, but that insisted on making themselves known regardless. The harmonica music drifted across the compound again that night, and this time when the brunette nurse heard it, she didn't think of it as the sound of the enemy. She thought of it as music, pure and simple, and she felt something in her chest loosen and expand in response to the melody.